Welcome to the XY Advisor Podcast, a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice. To get involved, go to xyadvisor.com or simply download the XY Advisor app. This series is brought to you by PIMCO, one of the world's leading fixed income managers. For 50 years, PIMCO has been dedicated to helping millions of investors pursue their objectives regardless of shifting market conditions. At PIMCO, ESG investing is an essential part of their commitment to delivering on their clients' objectives, while at the same time supporting long-term sustainable economic growth globally. Hello and welcome back to the XY Advisor Podcast. We are at episode 4 of our 5-part series when we're looking at all different things regarding ESG investing and portfolios and advice. In this particular episode, we're really tackling a very popular subject, that of climate change and the changing climate of climate change. So stay tuned to this episode and hear our expert panel talk about all the different things that they discuss with their clients around climate change and their investment portfolios. Welcome back, Nathan.
Thank you.
Fantastic to have you on this episode. We are talking the changing climate of climate change, one of your favorite topics.
Absolutely. I talk about this all day.
You can probably have a good rant about this all day as well.
Yeah, and I think you've heard or been on the receiving end of many of my rants about the inadequate or their complete lack of policy at the federal level and the handballing to the state level, where I think in this space we're seeing in Australia the people lead everything. So we've seen, I remember I lived next to an environmental engineer years ago, and he came from Germany to Australia, and he was shocked at how much of the work he was doing was in the private sector and not the government. Where in Germany, government leads most of it. And, it's companies and individuals and the state government as well. The state governments across the country are doing all the heavy lifting. And the federal government just fly, hey, look, we're doing something, but don't actually look what we're doing flags, which is infuriating, I think, for a lot of people, advisors, clients, everyone I speak to, I think, is frustrated by it.
Yeah, well, look, certainly financial advice is one of those professions that could have done a lot more earlier. And then when government stepped in, we got handed a whole lot of results that we didn't want. When it comes to climate change, I think there's probably the same conversations should be had at board levels within companies, and a lot of companies are moving early, not waiting for legislation.
Yeah, I mean, we've just seen Rio and BlueScope, I think it was, have signed a memorandum to find lower carbon steel production. So they're joining forces to reduce their own emissions. We've seen BHP divest its oil and gas operations to Woodside. I think that's at the mining level, but I think as individual companies are starting to be really conscious of their own emissions. I know super funds, at the institutional level, large super funds, when talking to external managers, ask them, what are your emissions of your portfolio? It's a massive topic right now. It's an easy one to identify. It's an easy one to manage. I think McVeigh v. Rest back in 2019 now, where the 25-year-old sued Rest Superannuation Fund for lack of climate disclosure. That drove a lot of this change in the institutional level because it woke people up to this is a material risk. It's a material risk to members of super funds who have got 30-year retirement horizons, and therefore it's a material risk to financial advisors who are working with clients who have 30-year retirement horizons and need to consider, under Standard 6, broader implications of their recommendations. So I think it's a huge area, but it's also very easily addressed because it's one factor. Climate change is an input-output factor. When you start looking at more complicated things like biodiversity, these complex systems, it's going to be so much harder. And so with this, we need to, I think we can lead the way. I think people are leading the way. The lower emissions products available in super funds are getting huge inflows now. The data out of RIA is showing that the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia are showing that ethical and responsible funds are growing at an alarming rate. And non-ethical responsibles actually fell in funds under management over the 2020 timeframe. And this is largely due to demand. I mean, we've never had enough, the amount of products and choice we have now. 2 years ago, there was 5 things. Now, you have to actually properly compare the various ethical products to see which is more targeted to your client, because there are so many options, and that's being led from consumer demand. But these consumers are also, management at large organizations, so they're trying to do things on both sides, which is excellent.
Yep. Now I want to get into this conversation around so much coming out, so many new things coming out. Along with that comes the marketing. Along with that comes a little bit of greenwashing. What are your thoughts?
I think it's rampant. It's absolutely rampant. So I think what's key to climate change as an advisor and identifying greenwashing is you want to understand the underlying holdings. You want to understand the benchmarks put in place. So if one fund says we don't invest in fossil fuels, asterisk, any company that generates more than 25% of their total revenue from fossil fuels, or fossil fuel production but not servicing companies, or those sorts of things, that's one way to look at it. And that's, but there's also something to be said about we don't invest in any fossil fuels at all. But fossil fuel companies could be leading the way. They could be the transitionary companies, because they're the ones with both the resources, the infrastructure, both human capital and physical capital, and the need to transition into low emissions. So I think engagement and funds engagement is another part of that. It's, hey, transition or we're out. It's voting records. Did the company or did this fund vote, holding ExxonMobil, did they vote against or for alignment to the Paris Accord, and what are they doing in that space, which can be tricky to identify as an advisor, because there's so many things to look for. But I think a lot of the greenwashing comes about, I think some of the best ethical funds have no ethical marketing at all, and some of the most ethical marketing are some of the worst ethical funds. So there's a real challenge for us as advisors to be able to see through that, and also, we're just so tired of the word ESG. I think it's flagged around everywhere with some really great stuff, but also some very lukewarm things as well.
Yeah. Now you mentioned Ria in that that grab that you just went through there. Talk us through how that's something that has helped you and been helping other advisors through this greenwashing conversation.
So RIA are a great organisation that, if you're not aware of them, you should check out their website if this is a space you want to start learning about. They've got they do annual reports on the market itself and what's happening there. They've got a screening tool. They look in, they engage with funds to improve. They hold conferences. They hold educational sessions. They're a really good place to engage and start. They're also they manage the certification of ethical advisor. So if you want to push into this space and sort of start moving more into, then they're considering that's really, really important. And, the more membership base they get, the more value they can create. So it's one of those self-fulfilling things. But they do a really, really good job there. And it's a good place as an advisor. They've got an advisor guide. Start with their advisor guide and then go from there.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, let's go back to government. Government can create policy, but as you mentioned, often it's the boards of these larger companies and those companies that are providing investment into those companies that are able to make real change happen. If in the lack of government doing so.
Yeah, so we saw earlier this year there was a case with ExxonMobil with I think 4 board members who were all climate change deniers. And in the US, they have a thing called shareholder resolution, where basically you can raise something as an issue and then encourage everyone to vote on it, and effectively becomes a bit of a campaign. And a tiny fund called Engine Number One started this campaign and ended up getting BlackRock on board to vote alongside them. And so they overturned management's decision and removed 4 members of the board who were climate change deniers and appointed 4, I suppose, people who believe in physics to the board. And it's going to help the transition of that entity move forward, and we know a lot of these large, traditionally fossil fuel and energy-based companies are talking about this, are engaging and are shifting because they have to. But that's also done because we are putting the pressure on them. And we had an inquiry earlier this year. The government led an inquiry into why fossil fuel companies can't get finance, insurance, and investment. And, we had fund managers on that inquiry. Robert and Nathan Parkin from Ethical Partners were on that inquiry. They spoke at that. So they are seen as experts in this space, and because they are. And I think the investment community, of which we subscribe to, have so much power to drive this change in the absence of federal government leadership.
Yep. And the other people involved in driving this change are, of course, the advisors, but also the clients from their own personal point of view and being able to make these decisions that we've been speaking about in the previous episodes. One of the things I wanted to draw back to, because you mentioned it, was the idea of being able to say to your client, your impact you've taken this many cars off the road, all those sorts of things. Tell us about how that works.
I think when you're looking at emissions in general, within a reasonable scope, you can say, I think Future Super released a study that if 11% of people completely removed fossil fuels from their portfolios in Australia, 11% of super, it would solve our issue with climate change. So I think as an individual, if you're looking at the things that you can do, you can eat less meat, you can drive your car less, you can turn off your lights, which a lot of the turn off your lights stuff was actually driven by marketing campaigns run by the polluters for years, and put the responsibility back on the individual when they have quite a marginal impact. But transportation and to a lesser extent, transportation of food really are the two big ones. So, how you source the power in your home is quite marginal on a small scale. But the next one is how you invest, because dollars drive change. So conscious capitalism, we can drive change. And that's, but if someone said to me, what are the three things I could do to improve my impact? I'd say, before getting rid of all pets, because I love dogs, and dogs are probably not the best thing for climate change. It's saying, eat less meat, drive less where you can, and review your portfolio, review your super, do something about it. You don't have to remove all fossil fuels, but have a real conscious effort of reducing the carbon emissions. So the average carbon footprint of an index product, like a diversified index product, is about 40 million metric tons. It is not difficult to get that down to somewhere between 5 and 12 million metric tons. So we're talking about a 75% reduction in emissions from your individual money, which is a 75% reduction. We're aiming to get that to half, and then be carbon neutral by 2050, and half by 2030, every other country but Australia. We could do 75% through our portfolio alone. And that would push demand, because those companies would see a mass divestment and therefore have to shift the ones that weren't coming along. So yeah, I think it's enormous power.
Fantastic, Nathan. Thanks for coming on. I love that. Saying you just dollars drive decisions. I think it's an incredibly impactful statement. Thank you so much. We look forward to catching you in the next episode when we're talking about asset classes.
See you then.
Thank you for joining us, Karen McLeod.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks again for having me.
You're very welcome. We are talking about the environment and the changing climate of climate change. Tell us about the conversations you're having with your clients about climate change.
I think the main thing that clients are really excited about is that they see we're really at this precipice, a real transition in, how as a planet we're working together to really quickly adapt and move together to race towards a net zero. So clients are understanding that technology and innovation has to be part of the solution, and they're really wanting to make sure that their portfolios are well set up for that. So we're talking about sustainability and climate change as a means for innovation. And also they're watching closely with all of the innovations that are happening overseas. And we certainly let them know about those and how their portfolio is benefiting, because we are global investors after all. And I think that's the real benefit of connecting with a financial advisor for clients, because traditionally you would maybe not go beyond Australia if you're an investor without an advisor. But, there are some wonderful opportunities elsewhere. I'll just note some milestones that our clients are benefiting from, which have been announced in the European Union. So they've announced the European climate law has been brought in. So where the EU have announced 55% emissions reduction targets, which are legally binding for member states. So clients within that portfolio, this is a London-based portfolio that we're invested in, have got a holding in the world's largest manufacturer of wind turbines, which is set to benefit from that. But it's not just, I suppose, renewable energy. It's also this whole renovation wave. So, the EU has announced that there'll be a massive overhaul by 2050 of buildings, because they're massive consumers of power. So looking at improving their environmental performance and cost savings. So a holding that clients have in that portfolio is a specialist in efficient buildings and infrastructure design, saving energy and other building materials that are more efficient, and also improving, obviously, safety and durability, all the way through to, more responsible foods and marketing and zero pollution for air, water and soil. So the EU has delivered a number of noteworthy milestones. So investors are excited that will, really drive performance going forward and deliver the climate change results we need.
Yeah, it seems that the EU is certainly leading the way in this space.
Yes, it definitely is. And I think that's the thing, sometimes clients are a bit despondent that they feel we're sort of, we are a bit behind the times here. But certainly when you think about their portfolio as an international portfolio, and that's the way I have always thought about, just despite the fact we're based here, you need to really remember that your clients do have large allocations in their portfolios to international shares. So how are they positioned positively for this future that we're rapidly transitioning to?
Yeah, I really like some of the words you've been using throughout the series: global citizen, global investors, and what you mentioned at the beginning, that's the race towards, and you said it a couple of times, the race towards net zero. When you say to me the race towards net zero, I think to myself, I want to be winning that race.
Yeah, it's true. I think the real challenge that advisors will face is actually not the question of whether or not to do this for clients, but it's actually how to deliver the solutions, because there are a number of different organisations providing product, and certainly the Responsible Investment Association for Australasia is a great tool to go to, because they do certify new products that are coming to market. So if advisors want to go and have a look at that, that's a good place to start. A cohort of advisors that I belong to, called the Ethical Advisors Cooperative, we also do a analysis of any fund that wants to participate. We do a survey, like a research survey. We call that the Leaf Ratings survey. So advisors are welcome to have a look at that. We put that out for consumers and advisors, anyone that wants to have a look. And we talk about all the positive points of the portfolio. So it might be that the portfolio, for example, has great exposure to climate change solutions. The portfolio has great transparency. They list all holdings. The portfolio engages actively, because there will always be problems that will come up from time to time in terms of, maybe it's procurement, like how are they procuring the materials that go into the solar panels, for example? Are there any human rights concerns? So there's always going to be an issue. So how transparent are they in their engagement with their suppliers? And then we also talk in that Leaf Rating section about any areas for concern. And that might be, for example, if a manager doesn't explain how they vote their proxies, or a manager, for example, has some questionable holdings in the portfolio that would often not align with an average ethical client's desires to invest ethically. So that will give you a few key things that you can then raise with your client and say, here's what I know about this fund. Is that of interest to you, or would that not be palatable because of those particular negative points? But it gives you something to talk about.
So just on that Leaf Rating, if you go to the Ethical Advisor Co-op website, you'll be able to then look at funds and see what the Leaf Rating is given to them?
Yes, we do. And we have done a number, but there's many more to still be done. So it won't be completely comprehensive of the whole marketplace, but it's certainly a starting point. And the Responsible Investment Association for Australasia also has their own search tool called responsiblereturns.org, which is freely available for this exact reason for advisors and consumers to use.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. So a resource that advisors or consumers can use, or that you can use them together. Exactly.
And there are many other research houses that are now promoting their wares, I suppose, in Australia. So one that's come to market recently from the States is Ethos Sustainable Platforms. That's in Western Australia, has been around for a few years. There's also many investment or asset consultants that are now providing model portfolios in this space, which you could consult with, or independent consultants that specialize in this area. Or, of course, you could look to some of the mainstream research houses like Lonsec, Sustainalytics, Morningstar, have also got some research in this regard as well.
Yep. Now, you mentioned in one of the previous episodes how even some of our mining companies are divesting away from things like coal or fossil fuels, or trying to present themselves in a way where they've got a greener shade to their rating. Tell us about what does that actually mean? Does that mean that those companies are divesting away? Those companies are, but other companies are still running them. So, what do you say to clients about how well that company still exists? And
I think it's really that they've worked out. It's not really about who's running the companies. It's just that it's no longer going to be like if you follow the whole divestment movement from fossil fuels. The point is that to keep to our targets for climate warming to be 1.5 degrees or lower, we know that we need to keep assets such as coal and oil in the ground. So it's just about preventing the stranded assets issue. So for clients, it's about protecting their capital from being in a position where those assets are written off. So just talking about divestment from fossil fuels, I think, protecting clients from stranded assets is a real threat. And that's why stewardship of their capital is an important concept to remember. The thing with where we're headed is that a price on carbon and a stronger price on carbon will continue. So the companies that are divesting are really trying to ensure that they remain viable for this new future. And the companies that are acquiring the assets, I can't quite work out why, but there might be obviously some issues with the companies that are acquiring them, but they would probably, I would argue, have headwinds rather than tailwinds. So that's a way to explain it to clients, is to say, we're really trying to position the portfolio for those thematics that are going to provide tailwinds for you, and these are the thematics that we see as being positive because we know a price on carbon is coming, and we know we have climate-related financial disclosures. And we know that COP26, there's been an agreement made. So we just need to make sure that your portfolio is in the best position for this transition.
Yeah, it's interesting terms, headwind and tailwind. I like those concepts. And you're right, the companies that are acquiring those assets, to me, it could only mean short-term gain, and sacrificing long-term.
Yes. And I think the other thing is when you think about financial performance, there will be a lot of companies transitioning in some shape or form. So that's a positive thing. So you can also keep your mind open for those clients that are okay with having some fossil fuels exposure. But if the company that is transitioning more quickly than peers, that's perhaps a good thing. So you might want to retain that holding in the portfolio if you know that that particular listed company is transitioning quickly compared to peers and has made plans for how they're going to position their assets for the future.
Yep. Karen, thanks so much for being involved in this episode. We look forward to wrapping the series up in the next episode and inviting you along.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fraser.
Welcome back to the conversation, David.
Thank you, Fraser.
Now, in this episode, we're talking about climate change and the changing climate of climate change, which has sort of led the way with a lot of this sustainability within ESG portfolios. People sort of think about sustainability, they think about climate change. Tell us about how it's working with you and your portfolios and your clients.
It's an interesting aspect. I mean, it's all over the place. It's in all the papers, even the News Corp papers are covering this at the moment. So that's clearly it's mainstream. It's a good hook, I think, to get people into the broader conversation about sustainability. It's very easy with all the publicity out there at the moment to pick a subject like coal or fossil fuels more generally, and work that back into what is sustainable and what's not sustainable.
Yeah, it's they're absolutely right. There's a lot of talk about digging things up from the ground and putting it into the atmosphere. How do you see technology playing a part in this? Obviously, the government have brought out their plans for net zero for 2050, and the technology is playing a big part in that. How do you see technology playing a part in it?
It feels like a bit of a loaded question. One thing about this whole subject from a client perspective is if people listening get one thing out of this and nothing else, don't play into the politics of it with your clients. All right, that's just it's like politics, religion, all that sort of stuff. Leave it alone and move on, right? So clearly technology's got to play a part. You have your Twiggy Forrest and those sort of people talking about green hydrogen, and we've been talking about carbon sequestration for God knows how long now. But I think it's kind of a secondary question. It's about the incentives and where the money's moving and where the investments are going. So, which will drive the technology. If I was to just say that they talked about cutting out coal in a large part of the world by 2030. So that's going to create a necessity to come up with alternatives. So. It'll follow the money. The technology will follow the money, I think, and when we're hard pressed, we can do some amazing things, can't we? But more often than not, we have to be hard pressed before we move.
Yeah. How do you see? I mean, we don't want to talk about politics. How do you see legislation driving this, or do you think fund managers and investors can drive this? Before the legislation kicks in and actually, make some difference through either influence or only investing in sort of deeper green portfolios?
Yeah, I think investors and companies more generally, and the people invested in them, be they fund manager or individuals, will continue to drive this. It feels like, with only a few exceptions, governments have been dragged along and are adjusting, legislation to meet the conditions which are being set by the business world. There's momentum there that's I think governments are generally struggling to catch up with. Now, I understand governments have a broad range of interests that they have to look after, and you can't go and tell coal miners are going to be out of job and not have a plan to get them out. But we're planners. We know what long-term planning is about, and I think if you don't have a plan, you're going to clearly be dragged along kicking and screaming and have to endure consequences which you hadn't anticipated. So I think as business and investors start to drive this more, then governments will have to start catching up.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, we're long-term planners, and that's the role, right? To keep the conversation about that long-term focus, and if the long-term, use of those fossil fuels aren't going to be around, then it doesn't make sense to be invested in them, I guess.
But again, I appreciate that if your ongoing service agreement goes for 3 years, that is till the next election, you'll struggle.
I like that, a 3-year ongoing service agreement, depending on the time frame. Fantastic. So what are you seeing in the space? Has there been a lot of change going on with regards to some of the investments in your portfolio in this space? Are they moving away? Are they changing? How have you seen the fund managers working?
It varies between fund managers, clearly. With the people with the authentic sustainability badges on them, I think that the money is following the technology more quickly than the ones which are kind of anchored into the old way of doing things. So I think across that fund manager universe, the rubber band's being stretched quite a bit by the people that are taking the lead on this and moving into the newer technologies, or not even necessarily the newer technology, but technologies which are more environmentally friendly, which doesn't necessarily mean a new technology, but existing technology which fulfills a portfolio criteria without having the negatives. So it's a very broad church.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the word long-term planning before. Do you think it's an advisor's role, duty, responsibility, I don't know what the right word is, around having these conversations with their clients to about the environment and about the about their returns and portfolios and how they sit? And I think, as you mentioned before, if they're not sustainable, then they're not sustainable.
Yeah, definitely. Now this can take a couple of directions. You can kind of take that conversation up front, as we've chosen to do, or as the environment changes, take them on that ride with them. So from our perspective, I guess that we want to front run this a little bit and make sure clients are positioned before the crowd gets to it. There's a term in technology where they talk about the adoption curve. So we don't want to be first adopters. We're more we want to be in that second tier where the adoption is picking up, and certainly not over the other side of the curve when it's all been priced in already, and you're kind of playing catch up. So I think from a returns perspective and from an outcomes perspective, you might be doing your clients a disservice by not at least considering the practical implications of these changes that are going on.
Yeah, and from the previous episode, we talked a little bit about that. What does that mean for the individual client? How is it that we can go around and talk about, your portfolio took this many cars off the road, or that your portfolio made this much difference when it comes to environmental impact?
Yeah, so there's I think I mentioned in the last episode that there's some quite in-depth reporting you can get now from fund managers and blend that into a communication for the clients. And going back to the barbecue story, it does give people a little bit of an extra incentive, if you like, to be going on this journey. But again, I think I'd emphasise that it's a nice to have and it is feel good, and you are doing good for the environment as well. But when the rubber hits the road, I think most clients are still going to say, well, what do the returns look like, and how is that affecting my long-term outcomes?
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely lots to consider and lots to weigh into that conversation. David, thanks so much for coming on this particular episode and talking to us about it. We look forward to catching you in the next episode with one of your your favourite subjects when we're talking about different asset classes.
Okay.
Thank you, Michelle and Claudia, for joining us again.
Hi, Fraser.
Hi, Fraser.
Now, we are talking about the changing climate of climate change. Obviously, as we've talked about before, it's a pretty popular topic at the moment.
Oh, it's massive at the moment. We've been talking about it. I don't want to sound too smug or anything, but we've been talking about it for years, and we've been talking about carbon in portfolios and the carbon information, and back in the early days of my previous life, I studied science, and we did whole things about the greenhouse story. So and now there's the climate change is just something that's with us, and I really think some of those environmental disasters or things that have happened recently, like the fires and the floods, and it's all a bit biblical, but climate change is here, and whether or not you're a climate denier, but a cleaner, greener atmosphere can only be good for everybody.
Yes, certainly. And why has it taken so long for the scientists to the scientists' words to get traction?
I don't know. I think that's political, and we probably shouldn't go there on this podcast. But there's a lot of politics around that, and we live in a country that is still hasn't accepted that potentially renewable energy is an option, and that perhaps coal may not be there forever, and it's a non-renewable resource, but it was cheap, provided good energy, but there's jobs elsewhere.
Yep, it certainly did. It was needed at the time, I guess you could say, and so it maybe it's run its course. There's a lot of calls for keep the carbon, keep the oil, keep the gas in the ground. Is that the only thing we're talking about when we're talking about environmental, though?
No, we talk about pollution as well, waterways. So the results from some of the weak mining activities. It touches everything from the air to the water to the what's the right word? Not apart from stealing land grab. So that impacts the communities, surrounding communities. So it's not just clean air.
Yeah, there's some really interesting conversations then to be had around like the technology that's involved in this as well. Some of the announcements recently from the government talked about using technology to filter and to take carbon out of the air as it's being produced, and all the way through to how do we reoxidize, how do we create better air quality, whether that's through trees or seaweed or whatever it might be. But tell us about some of this technology that's coming on and how you see that as an opportunity.
Well, the whole new technology or renewable energy is something that's very popular with our investors. So we're always trying to find some sort of investment solution that we can provide in our portfolios. And we do have that, but there's sometimes those technologies take a while to become profitable. So we have to be careful with clients' money to make sure that we're investing in things that are going to actually deliver something for them. But we're constantly looking for the technologies that will provide solutions for a better environmental outcome.
We've seen quite a few. I mean, in the renewable space, for example, we've seen, not just wind capture and solar. We've also seen wave energy. But sometimes these technologies, they have to go through a pilot phase, a testing phase, and then just putting it to the grid. To the grid. That's again another challenge. So there are lots of little interesting. What about bioenergy as well? Using waste to channel energy, and some of these technologies are actually running in some councils, but it just hasn't been able to take off. And there's a multitude of reasons behind that.
And sometimes like policy support might be something that's missing, like governmental policy.
Oh, very much, yeah.
So once the government is pushing for these things, I think that's when a lot more traction will be available. I mean, the government has money to spend in certain places, and if they could spend it in renewables, then I think that would see a huge growth and huge acceptance and development in renewables, because it's there. We have the technology. We're smart humans. We find out ways to solve problems, and we have the ability. Just have to have the will.
From what I've read so far and encountered with investments, it's all about policy. I mean, we talk about solar. The last few years, solar has done better. But if you wind back, if you take a look 10 years ago, policy was just not your friend. And as much as there was so much, as much as there's investor and community support for it, it could not take off because there was not enough support. And, if you want to talk about cost, that, cost was not competitive enough, policies, it doesn't have to be just grants. It just comes down to policy facilitating and making that infrastructure for these technologies to come through. That's really what we need.
Yeah, you mentioned you did mention councils in that previous grab, and councils and state government, all levels of government, I guess, are responsible for that.
Yes, and if we could, with the amount of rooftop solar that's out there now, I mean, some small communities in like a small council area, they could run their own little grid if there was enough support for that, and run their own electricity and between each other share things when the sun wasn't shining. And, if we could get to that stage, it'd be amazing. But, we also have big power companies who have the power.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. The power dynamic with the power companies.
Yes.
One of the things that probably doesn't get mentioned a lot in this space that I'm always thinking and concerned about is the long-term, like renewable energy, amazing, solar panels, for example. I think we still need minerals out of the ground to create solar panels. But then the recycling of those panels, when their shelf life ends in, 10 years' time, for example, or whatever it might be. Have you seen any technology in that space of, taking renewables like batteries and solar and then also renewing the renewable?
Yeah, there was a recent report that I read that recycling, catering for renewable energy is something that needs to now be looked at and developed very quickly, because we're not just talking about solar panels, we're also talking about lithium batteries. And we need a facility that is able to extract that and renew all those components. So when we come back to circular economy, we want to promote that as much as possible, very applicable to the renewable technology that we're constantly supporting.
Yep, and hopefully the energy that's required to renew the renewables is not taken up. It's not coal powered. So it's an ever changing thing. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about climate change. There's so many different aspects we could look into this, and I guess the overarching sort of theme to me is it takes all levels of business, all levels of government, and the desire to make it happen. And it looks like we're on that track.
And we can all do our little bit for it. Ride our bikes, go for walks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll catch you in the next episode when we start talking about the different asset classes.
Okay. Thanks,
See you, Fraser.
Welcome back, Grover Burthey.
Hi. Glad to be back with you, Fraser.
Now we're talking about the climate and the changing climate of climate change, the environmental aspects of ESG. The very first part of the conversation, and ESG is around environment. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing with the conversations you're having with advisors around the environment.
Well, this is naturally a very fluid topic, and one where we're spending considerable time allocating considerable resources at PIMCO across our ESG platform, and really being as front of market and as thoughtful as we can with regards to measuring climate risk and addressing the issues that the planet faces from a climate perspective. The questions that we are most frequently either receiving now or proactively asking ourselves are: how do you construct strategies? How do you measure portfolios? How do you measure progress from a climate perspective? And there's been increasing certainly over the last few weeks with the COP26 conference, but really over the course of the entire year to date and last year, an increasing usage of the phrase net zero, of the concept of net zero. There are various net zero commitments being made in different parts of the market. And that in and of its own right is a phrase that I think some understand what it means. Others use it as a proxy for environmental progress. Here at PIMCO, what we really want to look at is not just so simply how much carbon is in a portfolio, but what are we doing? What is a portfolio doing to try to make progress in some of these very difficult areas? And carbon emissions, carbon intensity are great proxies for that. But it's also important to identify who a climate leader is in a sector. If a sector has a climate leader or a laggard, it's important to acknowledge where a science-based target has been made. We heavily encourage the adoption of science-based targets and are supporters of the Science-Based Target Initiative. It will be increasingly important as many commitments are made to then measure if there's being progress. We don't expect it to be linear, but there has to be progress made. And then, seeing progress in some of the areas that are hard to abate sectors, cement, for example, heavy manufacturing, right? Progress in electric vehicles is important, but we're not going to solve the climate crisis purely by electric vehicles or light duty transportation. We need to go into some of these very heavy industrial areas and make progress. And so we really believe this is an area where you have to be heavily engaged with a range of different issuers. You have to have models and frameworks in place to measure progress. And you also have to be mindful of the fact that areas of the marketplace that don't react can be at real risk of obsolescence, risk of policy and regulators coming against them, risk of their consumers and their own sources of revenue perhaps moving away as well.
Yeah, it's very much a work with these businesses in the space. We mentioned earlier on, measurements and ratings, and I guess your measuring that you're doing internally is very different to the measurement that the end consumer might see. The end consumer might see this particular portfolio or fund might have a light green rating or this rating or that rating, whereas your measurements obviously measuring some pretty intense things within the businesses. Talk to me about that rating from a consumer point of view, that light green, dark green type conversations, and how do you see that sort of when it comes to consumer conversations?
Sure. Well, we for example, we have our ESG Global Bond Fund, which is one of our flagship ESG products. And I would very much flag it as one where the topic of climate is a top priority, and we're optimizing around these various considerations. And there, we look at carbon intensity, and we look at carbon intensity against a benchmark. We look at carbon intensity versus other comparable funds, whether they be at PIMCO or not at PIMCO, and are trying to have a degree that's much more acceptable from a carbon intensity standpoint. And I think right now it's approximately 25% of the carbon intensity of its respective benchmark. But that would be different from a strategy that, for example, says I only want exposure to companies that are going to have a tremendous impact on the environment immediately, right? Which may be more of what you're calling dark green, or for example, in Europe right now, what they're calling Article 9 under SFDR, where it's you're saying that the constituents of a portfolio are almost entirely determined and identified based on the degree of impact. It doesn't mean that a light green product or a broader ESG product isn't going to have that impact outcome, but it means that you're not taking a mandate and you're making it solely narrowly defined by the specific established criteria you put up front. And so, light green, dark green, I think there can be some sort of connotation that one is better or worse, or that, one is more ESG or less ESG. The reality is, I think that the way we think about it is different mandates have different criteria for them, and it's about mixing and optimizing what makes sense for a particular need. And also still being very, very intentional about the tools and the utilization of those tools across the board, just within reason and within different degrees of emphasis.
Yeah. Now, it very much feels to me like a lot of these bigger companies, it's like turning a large ship. It takes time. How are you working with those individual companies and, obviously setting targets and moving towards them and keeping them accountable? Is their attitude towards change a positive one, or do they feel like it's forced, or is it like, is this a proactive thing?
Well, it's I think broadly speaking, certainly there's been more receptivity on these topics from issuers, right, with each passing year, and it's because first and foremost, that's reflective of not just financial markets, but just the global population in general, right? There's more receptivity and acceptance of the fact that many of these issues need to be addressed and that they are creating certain underlying problems. Our efforts, as noted, are very focused in terms of having some degree of measurability, some degree of commitment, and some degree of transparency around it. And I would say that generally speaking, those conversations are productive, right? They're productive because I think issuers understand why that's important for an investor. They understand that we don't want to have these conversations and then walk away as if the problem's been solved. Now, the other side of it is that there are oftentimes, depending on the sector, not great methodologies or not great tools to actually do that. And so it goes back to my point on one of our previous conversations on how much you want your capital to try to help be part of the change, right? Versus a more exclusionary approach where you're saying you just don't want exposure to certain areas at all, and there are pros and cons to both. But the reality is that if there is a risk in being too dogmatic on some of these topics, because if the problems were easy to solve, everyone would have solved them already. So we do want to be mindful of the specific challenges that issuers face, what their intent is, and to the extent that they can make real progress, are they trying to do so, and are they trying to do so in an ambitious manner? But every sector is different, and every country is different, and we're all from different starting places, and that has to be taken into account.
Yep. Now, you mentioned the term climate leaders earlier, which I like. Is that something that they're looking at putting targets in place that's well above, say, net zero, 2050, for example, that governments are talking about? Are they looking at like a 10-year time frame rather than pushing it out to that far? What are the leaders doing?
Yeah, exactly. Part of it is to the extent, just establishing, right, a target, a science-based target to be specific. Anyone can establish a target. It may be something that would have happened organically either way. But adopting one that's aligned with a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, right, certainly puts one in place to receive that categorization from us. But more importantly than that, it's about then explaining and giving information about how you're going to get there. Right, because even adopting a science-based target in and of itself isn't necessarily right. I mean, we're at the beginning phases of these being heavily adopted. Well, heavy is a strong word. Of them being more regularly adopted, and over the next 5 years, and this was a big outcome of the COP conference for sovereigns, for governments over the next 5 years. We really have to shift from making these commitments to measurements and reports and really coming back to measure progress, because we've sort of moved. We're close to moving past the point where commitments are the most important. We're going to continue to encourage and engage and expect commitments and with certain targets. But we really are moving to a point where with the time that we have, there has to be progress against these goals.
Yeah. Now, when I hear the word 1.5 or 2 degree, of course, living in Australia, we think of the Celsius metric, and of course, your Fahrenheit metric. I did think about that when the conference was on, talking about 1.5, 2 degree, just trying to get the globe on the same page when it comes to the terminology. How are you going over there when it comes to individuals thinking 1.5, 2 degrees? Do they automatically go to Fahrenheit?
There are certainly colleagues we have here at PIMCO who very much believe that the whole world, right? This is not a conversation about Fahrenheit versus Celsius broadly, but that when it comes to climate, the whole world should move to Fahrenheit because a bigger number hopefully sets off more alarms. Most at this point know that when someone says 1.5, they don't mean Fahrenheit. But I must say, I'm not sure what the exact conversion is for that, but I'm sure it would make it quite hot in certain places here, particularly in the southern U.S.
Yeah, fair enough. And what are some of the great initiatives you're seeing from companies in climate change at the moment?
Sure. Well, beyond the science-based targets, one main commitment that many are making, which I think we want to see continued adoption of, generally speaking. But it's actually giving information about where capital will be invested or CapEx. So, it's a follow-on to the point on implementation execution. But okay, and this has happened by some of the automakers recently, that they're not only making these commitments in terms of, okay, where they want to go, but all right, how much R&D is going to be now attributed to for example, the electric vehicle space, and similar concepts in other areas. All right, you're a utility and you're saying that you're moving to cleaner sources of energy. Well, how much do you expect to be from solar and wind over the next 5 or 10 years? When exactly do you plan on reducing certain capacity in some of the more carbon intense parts of your business place? And giving the market the ability to then judge how material that is against past CapEx trends, against the overall balance sheet, and being able to make an assessment about is there a sense of urgency, right, or is this something that is really more back-ended in terms of the process that's coming on board. The other topic that's important here, just pure climate, and some very specific carbon topics get a lot of the airtime, but it's critically important that many of these strategies are comprehensive. We spent considerable time this year, for example, on the topic of deforestation. That's not delinked from carbon emissions, right? We need more forestry just to absorb carbon, but it's not cleanly in line with some of the more common topics that have been discussed in this subject matter with regards to utilities, oil and gas over the last several years. But areas, for example, in the food space and the agriculture space, various areas, but this comes to some degree to policymakers too. Are they protecting some of our natural resources, being able to facilitate more use of nature-based solutions? And then that will extend itself to other areas such as biodiversity, such as ocean security, water usage, many other areas that, like I said, are still have direct implications with regards to carbon and carbon emissions, but are also taking a blend of other environmental related issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more that biodiversity and deforestation and understanding that how the whole ecosystem works, not just about the carbon piece. Now, technology was obviously a big part of the solution for this. How are you seeing technology and in the space being, the savior or the next part of where we're going to from here?
Well, it's sort of the gift and the curse of many. If you look at many different pathways, many research pieces that have been put out by various market groups, right? There is an expectation and a necessity for certain new technologies or new alternatives to come on board, whether that be green hydrogen, whether that be a variety of other tools, whether it be electric vehicles, not just in the individual car or individual auto space, or not even heavy trucks necessarily, but you're talking about electric vehicles coming to locomotives, the shipping industry needs to decarbonize, sustainable aviation fuel for aviation and aircraft. There's so many things that need to happen. And for some of those, okay, the technology maybe is there, but it hasn't become cost efficient yet or cost competitive yet. For others, the technology is there, but it's hard to scale it. It's hard to sort of have it at the level where it can apply to major parts of the economy. And there just has to be progress there. And so we certainly want to invest. This goes back to our climate leader conversation. We certainly want to be invested in parts of the marketplace where they're making progress in these areas, because they're huge revenue opportunities, huge business opportunities for those. That will be great for PIMCO's ESG and non-ESG portfolios. But the other side of all this is this is where the private sector has to come through, because without progress in these areas, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve some of these net zero related objectives that from a macro perspective that the industry and the public sector are increasingly promoting. You really do need areas of the economy to be able to shift, where it's just not actually possible today, at least not in a cost efficient manner.
Brilliant. Thank you, Grover, for being part of this session. We look forward to catching you in the next one where we start looking at different asset classes.
Excellent. Look forward to it. Enjoyed it as usual.